already here. So hello and welcome everyone to our event today, Cultivating Compassion for Inclusion and Sustainability. This event is brought to you by UNIC in collaboration with University of Oulu, Oulu University of Applied Sciences during Sustainable Development Week. Also for your further information, this event will be recorded. Before giving the space to our speaker today, I would like to briefly explain what is UNIC. So UNIC is also known the European University of Post-Industrial Cities, an institution composed of 8 universities committed to boosting mobility and inclusion for societal impact. And in UNIC, we have 8 universities, as you can see in the map. University of Oulu, of course, it's one of them. Other universities are University College Cork, Erasmus University Rotterdam, University of Deusto, University of Liège, Ruhr University of Bochum, University of Zagreb, and Koç University in Istanbul. And in UNIC, we have 4 main aims, which are to co-create a European collaborative structure for higher education, to enable seamless mobility within UNIC to study, train, teach, and do research, to contribute to the resilience and renaissance of Europe's post-industrial urban centers, and lastly, to ensure social inclusion in university life and our super diverse post-industrial cities. So inclusion is actually also a term that we'll be discussing today. And without further ado, I would like to invite our speaker, Kate Kirk.
Mute myself. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my PowerPoint, and then I'll start talking. Let's see. Okay. So can everybody see my screen? Yeah? All right, great. So let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Dr. Kate Kirk. I am the project lead for Students in Education and the Diversity and Inclusion Office at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. And I'm in charge of our inclusive education policy. And you may be asking yourselves, what on earth does inclusion have to do with sustainability? And that's the question I hope together with you to answer today. And I want to use the concept of compassion to think about how we can unite these goals, these very lofty goals, societal goals, but also educational goals into our curriculum. I first want to show you a little bit of the work that we're doing and our approach to inclusion at the Erasmus University. So I'm going to unshare my screen very quickly, and then I'm going to show you a video that we've made recently, just to give you a flavor of how we're approaching inclusion. What I wanted to show you with this video, and this is part of our inclusive education knowledge platform, which we're building now, which will be available open access from the 18th of November, where we provide tools for teachers and pedagogic staff to create inclusive education. And in this video, we start with the premise that there is a problem and that people feel excluded. And to be included means to be able to be yourself, who you are in diverse perspective, in your social identity, in your personal identity, in your cultural identity, and also to have your voice be heard, not to simply, and to have impact, not simply to have to assimilate into the university's culture. So to actually have a voice and a chance to change that, and that's how we see inclusion and our objectives. So this is so intimately linked to our goals of sustainability, because we are creating connection. We want to create connection between people and societal change. But how we do it is what I want to talk about in this presentation today. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is something very, very difficult for academics. Are you ready? You think you're ready? It's very difficult, right? I'm going to ask you to think about how you feel about the image I'm about to show you, not what you think. So everybody knows basic feeling words like sad or happy or angry. And you can expand on those. And of course, it's difficult in this context since we're speaking in English and we're always so much more, we can think more precisely in our own languages. So feel free to write your own, to write the term in Finnish or whatever your native language is as well in the chat. But I wanted you to think about and write down what you feel when you see this image. Okay, I think I see the chat is filling up. And while you do that, I'm going to unshare my screen again, and I'm going to try to share the audio of the computer. And I want you to listen to a story about polar bears. This is, if everyone can hear, this is from the book Untamed by an American activist and author, Glennon Doyle. And this is a story in her latest book, Untamed, as I said, about her daughter and polar bears. So I'd like you to listen to it. It's about 5 minutes long, but it's very telling of the direction we're going to go in this presentation.
Several years ago, my daughter Tish's teacher called and said that there was a situation at school. During a discussion about wildlife, she'd mentioned to the class that polar bears were losing their homes and food sources because of the melting ice caps. She showed the students a photo of a dying polar bear as an example of the many effects of global warming. The rest of the kindergartners thought that this was sad information, but not sad enough to keep them from, soldiering on to recess. Not Tish. The teacher reported to me that when the lesson ended and the other kids popped off the carpet to run outside, Tish remained seated, alone, mouth wide open, stunned into paralysis, her little shocked face asking, "What? Did you just say the polar bears are dying because the earth is melting? The same earth that we live on? Did you just drop that little tidbit of terror on us at circle time?" Tish eventually made it outside, but was unable to participate in recess that day. The other kids tried to get her off the bench to play foursquare with them, but she remained close to her teacher, wide-eyed, asking, "Do the grown-ups know about this? What are they going to do? Are other animals in trouble too? Where is that hungry polar bear's mom?" For the next month, our family's life revolved around polar bears. We bought polar bear posters and papered Tish's wall with them. "To remember, Mom, I've got to remember." We sponsored 4 polar bears online. We talked about polar bears at dinner, at breakfast, during carpool, and at parties. We discussed polar bears so incessantly, in fact, that after a few weeks, I began to hate polar bears with every fiber of my being. I began to rue the day that polar bears were ever born. I tried everything I could think of to yank Tish out of her polar bear abyss. I coddled her, I snapped at her, and finally, I just lied to her. I asked a friend to send me an official email pretending to be the president of Antarctica, announcing that, once and for all, the ice caps were fixed and all the polar bears were suddenly A-OK. I opened that fraudulent email and called to Tish in her room. "Oh my gosh, baby, come here. Look what I just got. Good news." Tish read the email silently, then turned slowly toward me with a scathing look of scorn. She knew the email was fake because she is sensitive, not stupid. The polar bear saga continued, full force. One night I tucked Tish into bed and was tiptoeing out of her room with the joy of a mother who was almost to the promised land. Everybody's asleep and I've got my couch and carbs and Netflix and no one is allowed to touch me or talk to me until the sun rises, hallelujah. I was closing the door behind me when Tish whispered, "Wait, Mom?" Damn it to hell. "What, honey?" "It's the polar bears." Oh, hell no. I walked back to her bed and stared down at her, a little maniacally. Tish looked up at me and said, "Mommy, I just can't stop thinking. It's the polar bears now, but nobody cares. So next, it's gonna be us." Then she rolled over, fell asleep, and left me all alone in the dark room, stunned into paralysis myself. I stood over her, eyes wide, arms wrapped around my body. Oh my God, the polar bears. We have to save the mother freaking polar bears. Next, it's gonna be us. What is wrong with us? Then I looked down at my baby and thought, you are not crazy to be heartbroken over the polar bears. The rest of us are crazy not to be.
I want to show you another picture and ask you again how you feel about it. What feelings, what emotions it brings up in you. This is from an article in the New York Times about increasing levels of flooding in various Indian states. So what the experience of Glennon Doyle's daughter, Tish, about the polar bears and the alarm that she felt, many of us don't feel about polar bears, and we also don't feel it about others. The racial, ethnic, gendered, sexual other. For reasons I want to talk about in a minute. But what I will argue here today is that the basis of sustainability and inclusion involves moving beyond our ideas of our species difference, our geographical differences, our gender differences, our ethnic differences, and thinking about what connects us, what makes us one. And I believe that we can do that through the act of compassion. Compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. It's only when we know our own darkness that we can be present with the darkness of others. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. And in this case, I would expand it to our shared life on Earth. Compassion is we often, in the work that I do in inclusion, we talk about empathy, this understanding of the experience of the other. I can have empathy maybe for this Indian woman whose house has been flooded, who's lost her home and maybe her crops, for instance. But it's a cognitive process. I can try to understand the way she feels, the way the polar bear feels or is, the experience that they're having. But I'm maybe not having it myself because I can't really relate to it. My house has never been flooded. I've never starved to death in the ice, in breaking ice, I should say, or melting. So how can I have compassion for that? And I think the answer is that we need to move to the next level or a deeper level of experience. But what gets in the way? And I saw in the chat, I just briefly looked, I haven't seen all the comments, but I saw one that said guilt. And I would say that guilt is part of the process of what I would say is comparative suffering. So what is it? And these are two pictures. One is of the Dutch Queen and King tromping around in the water in the south of this country during the summer when there were floodings in Germany and in the southern Netherlands. And most of the victims of the floodings in the Netherlands and in Germany were insured. They may not be fully paid. That's a very complicated issue and related to climate change. But they will eat. They will survive. They're devastated. But is it to be compared with the suffering of this Indian woman? When we think about comparative suffering, we don't see our own pain, actually. And where that seems to put perspective, I think it actually creates a great deal of differentiation. Differentiation that makes us kind of immune to seeing the pain of others. Because loss is loss. Pain is pain. And we have experienced loss, maybe not the loss of our home, but all of us can go down and think about a time if we lost a piece of jewelry or we lost a loved one, or maybe we've also lost our homes. But that feeling of loss that I think many of us have felt, we can feel that with this woman. We can feel that with the residents of the south of the Netherlands, of Limburg, pictured here. So that comparative suffering creates also shame. So shame is the idea, according to research professor Brené Brown, an American researcher and activist, that shame is the idea of being unloved, unworthy. And our pain becomes then, in this comparative suffering, becomes unworthy. And that is a feeling that we don't really matter. And I see that very often in my work of inclusion. The white man in a position of power who feels that he's being made into the villain in diversity and inclusion work because he is privileged. And this creates a lack of understanding, a lack of connection, and most importantly, a lack of compassion, where the white man, just like the Indian woman, does not exist. Our identities and who we are complex. I was in a discussion with a white man who was rather annoyed with the work that we were doing in the inclusion office, and felt that he was being made into a villain. And he didn't feel like he was being seen because his origins were working class. He wasn't a wealthy, privileged person. He didn't see himself like that. And that's why we have to think about our identities and our positions in a more complicated way, so that we can reach the compassion that we need for sustainability and inclusion. So when we think about human identity, we have to understand that there are many different layers. And here I'm going to talk about the fundaments. And that is that everyone is the same as all other people. Everyone is the same as some other people. And everyone is different from all other people. Isn't that amazing? The human condition. This is the human condition. And it comes down to these three different levels of being: the universal, the cultural, and the personal. And I have here a picture of people eating. And I wonder if what you see the universal, the cultural, or the personal. Maybe you can just put that in the chat really quick. So what do you see? I don't know if I can. And I can't see the chat now with my screen shared. But if we think about the question of having to eat at regular intervals, do you think universal, cultural, or personal? Well, that's a universal. Our bodies need food. But what is cultural and personal is how that regularity is understood, right? Is breakfast part of our cultural ideas of eating? When do we eat? What do we eat? How do we eat it? with our hands or with utensils. Those are cultural and in some cases personal. If someone has an allergy or other particularities about the way they eat. So that we need food that pertains to all of us, including those outside of our species, as we saw with the polar bear. So those are universals, but also things like mourning. So at loss, feeling sad, grieving, universal across the globe. But how we grieve. Do we wear white or do we wear black? Do we yell and scream? Or do we close our doors and grieve on our own? Those are cultural and personal, and very often we get caught in thinking about these differences that are at this cultural and personal level. And it's at this universal level of being that we can express and act with compassion. That is not to say that in the work of inclusion and sustainability, we do need to consider and have empathy for, try to understand the cultural and the personal. And in our educational systems, how do we create an understanding of these different levels of being and create the climate in which students and teachers learn together about how to act globally and locally? So these are the questions that we need to ask ourselves about our educational systems. We need to ask about the who, the how, the what, and what did I miss? And the how as well. So 2 times I have how here. And that is, one pertains to power issues and one pertains to how we're teaching. So who are we teaching and who is teaching? Who's in front of the class and who's in the audience? Is it a diverse group? Are we reaching out across the globe and across Europe, as we're trying to do with UNIC? Are we reaching across society to all levels? Are we bringing everyone into the classroom that needs to be at the table to think about these issues and resolve them? How are classes being taught? Are we teaching them in inclusive ways? Are we teaching them in ways that students learn to think out of the box? What is being taught? What kind of materials are we saying is knowledge and is truth? And how are decisions made about how the classes are taught and what is being taught? So what my work is primarily concerned with the lower quadrants here. So the how are classes taught and what is being taught. And that's what I want to talk about in the last bit of this presentation. So I see inclusion as involving 4 key elements. And in those 4 key elements, I'll try to take you through how I see that they relate to also increasing our awareness and our practices of sustainability. So the first key element that needs to be involved in our universities overall and in our classrooms, so at a micro, macro scale, or a meta scale as well, is community building. And what is community building? It's creating an environment in which diverse people feel they belong. They feel like they can bring their whole selves to the table. And we can do this through activities as simple as, yeah, we create a culture where people belong. We have funny handshakes, or we have icebreaker activities. But it also goes beyond that. It goes beyond into saying, you are here as who you are. And the endeavor of academic work is hard. It's very hard. But we're here to support each other. And this is how we support each other here. It's also being explicit. Who's here to help you? How can they help you? And where are the limitations? It's making all those things clear, which often, maybe at your university is better, but at ours is sometimes not clear for all the students. Those with functional impairments, those with those who are first generation students, for instance, they don't always know where they can get the help they need to be part of this, to be fully part of the community. So that's the first step in inclusive education. And why that's important to sustainability is also because sustainability is about understanding the connections that we have to each other through this universal, but also that our needs and the way we live are different, but united. So it's about creating connection, and connection is key to both inclusion and sustainability. Sorry, I'm having problems again. The second is critical self-reflection. We need to give students the tools and the opportunity, the time, to think about who they are in social space. What is it to be white? What is it to be European? What kind of privileges do we have? But also, what kind of restrictions do we have as migrants, as maybe gendered minorities in particular areas, as sexual minorities? How does that influence who we are, who we want to be, where we want to go? What about at the personal level? What are our talents? What are our skills? What can we contribute? The idea behind this is also that when we know ourselves, we can cultivate a space where there's less shame, less guilt, less comparison, and that we know who we are and we can be open to the experience of the other. So we need to create pedagogic tools and time that gives students the opportunity to think about who they are and what they want to do. We're not always doing that because we want to get through the materials. But the person needs to be at a human-centered approach to education, I think will promote both inclusion and sustainability. My mouse is just not cooperating today.
Kate, maybe if you try also with enter, usually it works.
No. For some reason, it won't. Yeah, there we go. So communication. How do we learn to communicate? Many of us in inclusive education, we think about intercultural communication, but how are we communicating more generally with each other? Are we communicating in a way that we're not only learning to speak, but learning to listen. Because learning to listen is about understanding how, for instance, these human universals play themselves out in particular cultural and personal circumstances. How do we understand the impact of global warming without having to listen to someone who's experiencing it, maybe on the other side of the earth? How we need the tools to do that. At the Erasmus University, we have, and what we all know from discussions on sustainability, they're not without polarization. We have depolarization tools that we can learn to listen to each other. We can learn to come to compromise. We also use the tools provided by what's called nonviolent communication. And this is about knowing yourself, what you need, what you're feeling, and asking the other if they can meet you in that. These are all, and intercultural communication. So understanding how we communicate, we all communicate as humans and as animals in different ways, but how to understand what those communications mean and have empathy for how people do that in different ways. So this is another key skill that we need to be giving students and teachers. And this is something that takes time and practice. It doesn't happen overnight. And finally, we need to think about the contextualization of knowledge. So the knowledge that we're giving to our students, that we're producing and reproducing, where is it coming from? Who's creating it? So we need to give students the skills of critical thinking, to think about those questions, to question science, because science is not a thing. It's not static. It's a discussion. It's an ongoing discussion. And that discussion, to have it be inclusive and sustainable, needs to have very different voices involved. And we need to understand that students need to have, and what we've seen in the Netherlands is increasingly is maybe I would say watering down of the curriculum, and where we don't have basic philosophy of science being given to students, so they don't develop these critical thinking skills. They don't understand the premises of science. And what we also see is that our curriculums are often ethnocentric. The authors are, and I was once told by a program, well, we teach a class on, the basics, and it's all dead white men. Well, that's a problem. If that's the basis that you're teaching students, we need to have different perspectives, to have broader minds, and have those minds be able to think out of the boxes, because we need to move beyond where we are now if we're to truly have an inclusive and sustainable society. And it's vital to our very survival. So I wanted to end with this. It's very simple and very difficult. So what would be success? What would be successful education? Well, maybe if we had a world with more love, through compassion, through empathy, through an understanding of these different levels of being. And that's hard work that hopefully we can do together within UNIC. And finally, I just wanted to say, if you'd like to know more about how we at the Erasmus University understand and have organized our inclusion and diversity, the website is here. You can also just Google diversity and inclusion at Erasmus University, and you'll come to this website. And if you're interested in knowing more about our inclusive education platform, which will be launched, as I said, on the 19th of November, and will provide tools, networks, trainings for particularly for teachers, program directors, educational program directors and pedagogic support staff on how to make their education more inclusive. You can email me, and my email is here. It's kirk@ur.nl, or my colleague Samuel Whitcomb, and his email is here as well. He's the project coordinator for the Knowledge Platform. So now I'd like to, we have about 10 minutes. It's really not enough, but if there are any questions, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see each other better. And I hope we can have a little bit of a discussion. And Anke, would you like to moderate that discussion, or?
Yes, of course. So if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat, or alternatively, you can raise the hand and we can unmute you. Okay, so we have already someone that raised their hand. Let's just unmute. Yes, can you hear us now? Kayotrino?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Thanks, Kate. That was really thought-provoking presentation. Really enjoyed it. And I just wanted to say, I think it's really welcome that the idea of inclusive education is being talked about in this way, because very often I think terms like inclusive education can become almost like, technology based, like techniques of the classroom, rather than a broader way of thinking about education. And I just had one question about the aspect of critical self-reflection, because I think that's something that makes a lot of sense when we think about teaching, within the social sciences and the humanities, where the critical self-reflection of the student is really important. But I'm just wondering how you kind of conceive of that in other types of disciplines. For example, what does critical self-reflection mean in the sciences, or engineering, for example?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. It's actually something I was talking about last week with colleagues who are really struggling with creating inclusive education policies in STEM, so in science, maths, and medicine. Our medical school, where I'll start with that, has been one of the most kind of advanced faculties in thinking about it, but it's because of the human side of their work, and also the climate in which the faculty found itself. So there it's very clear that we need this inclusion so that we can work with diverse populations, so that the doctors of the future are prepared for the diversity, but also in science, in engineering, where I think that if we think of the challenges in particularly, let's focus on engineering and maybe physics and maths, is that we have there's very little diversity in many programs. It's very male dominated. Also few minorities. And what I've seen in the US, for instance, I saw a talk recently from a professor at MIT who was a Hispanic woman and one of the few in her field. And she had said, what's important is to think about inclusive education for the sake of bringing in different perspectives and diversity of students. And there's a business case for that, in that we need these diverse perspectives in every field. I mean, Thomas Kuhn himself was a physicist who said that the paradigm shifts are always happening in science. And how do these paradigm shifts happen? Well, one of the ways is through new people, different perspectives coming from outside. It's how we grow science. And we need that. If we have the same people and the sons of doing the work, we don't get these new perspectives. And how do we create, why is it, so we need these people. And how do we do that? We need to think about how we're teaching. So for instance, this professor who's, I'm very sorry, her name escapes me at the moment, but if you're curious, you can email me and I will give you her contact information and her articles. Is that she said very simple interventions can help. Physics, for instance, her own field, is extremely difficult. So, and many students don't know that or hear that. So having one very small intervention at the beginning of a class where the teacher and older students say, you know what, this is hard and I've failed. I failed my first test. I failed my second test. I failed my first class. But here I am now, the professor, or here I am now, the third year honor student. Hearing that helps students. Oh, and the second step is then saying, this is how we can support you. There's these study groups. You can create a study group. We have extra maths help. Having this conversation at the beginning of a physics, math, engineering class can, I believe she said, up to 30% higher retention rates for women and minorities. This very simple intervention. So that's why it's important in STEM. And I hope that answers your question. And if anyone's interested in this wonderful speaker that I heard, I can send you the information. So please just email me.
Okay, and we have one more question. I think that's going to be the last one. So Claire, I think, raised her hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi. Yeah, my question kind of follows on from what Katrina's question was previously. But firstly, I would just like to thank Kate for such a fascinating presentation. And I really buy into the ideas and I try to use them myself in my own teaching practices. And what I really liked as well about it is this idea of who holds expert knowledge. And for me in my teaching, I focus very much on the lived experience of those who are most vulnerable. My question relates to, I suppose, the power dimensions within the classroom. Yeah. And particularly, I find it myself sometimes uncomfortable because I may have 3 Black students in the classroom of about 30 students. And then I'm talking about things related to the construction of race. I'm talking about oppression. I'm talking about power. And in the classroom, I'm always conscious of how what I'm addressing is impacting on those who have experienced this. Yeah. And I suppose my question is, I mean, you talked about, which I think is really important, is building connections and getting students to connect. But I just wondered, in those circumstances, and I know you talked about shame and guilt, and I do address that with my students as well, in terms of even how students who might be in the majority might experience discomfort from the classroom experience also. But I suppose my question just relates specifically to that. And do you have any tools that can be used in terms of breaking down those kind of barriers to ensure that the students who are in the minority or who may have experienced some very traumatic experience or who have come through the asylum system are now sitting in the class, and I'm addressing these issues as a white person, telling my class about the experience of somebody living through the asylum system, when I'm conscious of people in my classroom that are actually after going through the lived experience of that. So my question is, do you have any advice or any suggestions around tools that may be able to break down some of those barriers or open up a space where it's less uncomfortable?
Yeah.
It's a big question.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. That's great. It is so hard. It is so difficult to talk about these as the expert in front of the class, and very often having the expectation of the students that you are. So I think that my first advice would be that you need to really start from day one in creating a culture where students can share their experiences and where you can be wrong or not know or ask. But of course, to ask somebody to share, they have to be willing and want to. You don't want to put anybody on the spot. So I think from day one, you need to set the tone for the kind of class you want to have. And if you want them to be sharing their expert knowledge, you have to make it safe. You have to make it psychologically safe for them. And I think one way of doing that is also by, from day one, using the same example I just did for the STEM studies, is having on day one just time to be vulnerable and to be human. This is hard. We're going to talk about difficult things. I find it difficult. This is challenging for many teachers who feel like they must be an authority figure. And you do have to be an authority figure to a certain extent, because you are judging or grading, marking different assignments, for instance. But you need to set the tone in the classroom for, we can be vulnerable together. I can be vulnerable for you, but these are the limitations. So being explicit as well is so important, I think, in inclusive and especially in diverse classrooms. These are the things we can share. These are the things that maybe we should do in small groups. I also think that in terms of sharing experiences, difficult experiences in terms of a refugee background, racial discrimination, or other forms of discrimination, is to first, if you want students to talk about it, to do, and again, these are just tricks, but also to have them talk in small groups before they speak in the whole group, to create a culture in which people know each other. Sometimes we have these huge lecture halls where people are anonymous. It's very difficult to share your story if you don't know who's listening. So to create as much as you can a culture where people know each other. I have some tools. I have one tool on community building that will be on the knowledge platform. You can also email me for it, and I can send it to you beforehand if you're interested. And I also think, speaking on one very quick note, I think it's also, again, in terms of compassion and comparative suffering. Claire, you're Irish, I think, if I'm hearing. I am as well, of the American variety, so I grew up in the States. But I used to teach a class on race, and I would start with a book called How the Irish Became White. And it's also about understanding pain in different ways and understanding racial discrimination in different ways and how it's changed through time. This can be very uncomfortable, but it's also about seeing the contextualization and understanding your own and your own kind of history and pain in terms of, the limitations placed through colonialism, or, the book well. So to use things like that, tools like that as well, to also put yourself and to put kind of discrimination, racism, migration, and the pain and trauma thereof into different contexts and personalize it. So, yeah. I guess we're out of time now, but I don't know if anybody has any other questions. Please don't hesitate to email me. And I hope that I've given you some inspiration, and I hope that you'll visit our knowledge platform when it's finished. Please, email me about it if you want to be there on the 18th when we launch it, or if you, keep our website in, keep it. I'm thinking in Dutch. Keep it. Keep your eye on it. That's the term I was thinking of, and join us there, and also please, we also want to share the things that you're doing in your classrooms. I think there's so much knowledge within UNIC, within our universities, that we need to start sharing with each other, and we need to have these conversations more. So thank you all, and I look forward to maybe meeting you someday, but let's keep in touch.